All right, just 1 second till I connect to my phone, and then we'll get started. All right. Cool. All right, hello everyone. My name is Mete Atamel. I'm a developer advocate at Google, based in London. But as he said, I'm originally from Cyprus, so it's great for me to be here in Athens. I always feel like coming back home. Today we're going to talk about Knative. But before I start my talk, if you go to this GitHub page, and this is the QR code, you have the slides, and you have all the demos that I'm going to show today. So if you want to take a picture, this is the one picture that you should take. The second thing is my talk is demo-driven, so if you want to see it, you probably want to be closer, because the screen is a little bit small. But if you want to just hang out and just watch me, hear me speak, that's fine as well. And the other thing I want to mention before I start talking is that Google Cloud has a startup program. So if you are a startup, you can get $3,000, $20,000, or $100,000 free credits from Google. I always mention this in my talks because I like to help startups. So this link, bit.ly GCP for startups, if you're interested, feel free to go and apply. And if you're eligible, you can get free credits to run on Google Cloud. All right. And by the way, I took yesterday off to just see Athens a little bit. Even though I've been here before, I just wanted to do a little bit of sightseeing. But it wasn't a good idea to walk around in 30 degrees all day long. Since then, I have a headache, and I still have the headache. But we'll see how it goes today with the talk. All right, so who is here, before I start my talk, who is here running code with containers, with Docker? OK, a few people. So out of these people, who is here, who's managing these containers with something like Kubernetes? OK? So you are my target audience. Knative, it's a technology that's built on top of containers and Kubernetes. And basically, it's a way to have a serverless kind of experience on Kubernetes. For the rest of the people, hopefully, you'll still learn a few things about what Knative is. But my main audience is people who are actually using Kubernetes, and they're looking a way to run serverless on top of Kubernetes. So what is Knative? Knative is Kubernetes-based open source building blocks for serverless. And if you know anything about Kubernetes, at this point, you might be a little bit surprised, because there's nothing serverless about Kubernetes. Kubernetes is all about having nodes, which are either physical machines or virtual machines, and scheduling containers on top of these nodes. But that's the whole point of Knative. Knative lets you treat Kubernetes as a serverless platform. And hopefully, by the end of this talk, you'll get an idea of how that works. Now, first, let's do some definitions about what I mean by serverless. So in an ideal serverless framework, first of all, you shouldn't care about servers, right? Obviously, there's servers somewhere, and obviously, someone has to maintain them. But ideally, if you are working on top of a serverless framework, all of that should be abstracted away from you, and it shouldn't be your problem. Secondly, if you are, let's say, a C# developer like me, you're probably used to using a ASP.NET Core framework. You should be able to use that framework on top of the serverless framework that you're running. Like, you shouldn't have to use a special framework just for the serverless. Similarly, if you're a Java developer, you're probably used to using Spring Boot. You should be able to use that on the serverless framework that you're running on, right? So you want the serverless framework to be idiomatic. Third thing is that serverless is usually event-driven. So something usually triggers your function, or something triggers your container. And finally, once you take your service and deploy, you should be able to take that service and deploy to some other place without that much trouble. You shouldn't have to rewrite your code, or you shouldn't have to change a lot of things to take your code and run it in different places, right? You want things to be portable. And Knative, it kind of ticks all these boxes. And throughout this talk, you'll see how it kind of helps with all of these problems in a nice way. And for those of you who might not know Kubernetes that much, just briefly to cover Kubernetes. So the idea of Kubernetes is that first you start with your code. So you have your container, your container image in a registry. Then you create what's called a pod template. A pod is a single unit that you schedule in Kubernetes. It's either a single container or multiple containers that are scheduled together. And then you tell Kubernetes what you want to be true. For example, in this case, we are saying we want to have 3 replicas, and the replication controller in Kubernetes will look at the nodes that you have in your system, and it will schedule these pods onto nodes. So the scheduling of the pods and the scheduling of the containers, now it's Kubernetes' problem, so it's not your problem anymore. Then once you have your pods, you can attach labels to your pods, and then you can group pods into what's called services. These services, these Kubernetes services, they have stable virtual IPs, and you can configure domains for them. And people from outside will get to your service, and from there will get to your pods. So as you can see, in this world, a microservice ends up being a combination of your code via the containers, and a combination of what Kubernetes provides with replication controller, with pods and services. But as an application developer, I don't care, right? As an application developer on a serverless framework, all of this are the details that I shouldn't have to care about. So application developers, they love serverless because it gives us a higher level abstraction to work from so that we don't have to care about the underlying infrastructure. Now, at the same time, operators, they love Kubernetes because Kubernetes gives them a way to manage containers in a scalable way using an API, right? So there's this tension between application developers not wanting to care about infrastructure and operators wanting to care about infrastructure and wanting to use Kubernetes. So how do you bring these two worlds together? That's the problem that Knative is trying to solve. So Knative, it's an open source project on GitHub. And it's a set of components. And these components are serving, eventing, and build that we'll go through individually. And they basically came from Google. So all the learnings that we had at Google, we kind of learned from them. And then we created this project for the open source world. Now, there's other companies like Red Hat and IBM and SAP and many others that are contributing to Knative as well. And it's an open source project, so you can also contribute and use it if you want. Now, the Knative stack kind of looks like this. At the bottom, you have the Kubernetes as the base platform where everything runs. Now, on top of that, you need a gateway. So Knative doesn't really handle the networking details of your cluster, right? Instead, it relies on a gateway like Istio, or more recently, something called Glue for networking details. Just to let you know, Istio is the main dependency of Knative, and it provides a lot of features, and that's what most people use with Knative. But it's kind of heavyweight. When you, for example, on Google Cloud, if you want to use Istio, you need to have 4 nodes, and they need to be kind of mid-sized nodes, so it's not that small, and it's not that cheap to run. That's why recently there's been some movement on adding another gateway, and people added Glue. I haven't used Glue. I don't know if anyone here use Glue? No. Yeah, from what I heard, it's basically a lightweight gateway compared to Istio. But if you use Glue with Knative, it doesn't support Knative eventing yet. So you need to keep that in mind. So you have your Kubernetes platform. On top of that, you have the gateway for networking details. And then you can install the components of Knative, build, eventing, and serving. You can install all of them at once, or you can install them individually as you need them if you want to. And the idea is that once you have the Knative primitives, you would use something else on top of that for the developer experience. For example, there's something called Google Cloudrun, which is the managed version of Knative on Google Cloud that's built on top of Knative, but it gives you a fully managed version. If you want to stay on Kubernetes, there's a Google Cloud Run on GKE, which is the same Google Cloud experience, Google Cloud Run experience, but on Google Kubernetes Engine. And there's other products from other companies as well that's being built on top of Knative. So today's talk is more about the Knative open source, and I'm going to show you actually how to install and use Knative as if you're installing it yourself. But in reality, if you are already in the cloud, like Google Cloud or some other cloud, you would use something else that the cloud provider provides to you, like Cloudrun. So I'll also show a demo of Cloudrun briefly, but most of the focus of the talk is the open source version of Knative. All right, so how do you use Knative? Well, first you need a Kubernetes cluster. So you can either set that cluster yourself if you're running it locally, but if you're on Google Cloud, this is a single command line tool that will get you a Kubernetes cluster. By the way, in Google Cloud, you can also say add-ons, and you can also say Istio. What this does is that it gives you a Kubernetes cluster with Istio installed already, so you don't have to install Istio separately. So you get a Kubernetes cluster, then you need to make sure that Knative can manage this cluster, so you create what's called a cluster role binding. And then once you have that, you basically just install Knative. So in this case, I'm installing the latest version of Knative, 0.6.0. And I'm installing all parts of Knative. So Knative serving, Knative build, and Knative eventing as well, right? But you don't have to. You can install them individually as you need them. All right, so let's actually make sure that our cluster is up and running. And I know it's a little bit hard to see from the back probably, so let me try to make this a little bit bigger. So here I am in Google Cloud console. I already created a cluster, Knative 06 for the latest version of Knative. And I just want to make sure that this cluster is up and running. So here I am in console. So let's make this a little bit bigger. It's very hard to see, but hopefully you will get the idea. So what I want to do is kubectl get pods. And in Knative, everything gets installed under separate namespaces. So for Knative serving, so let's make this a little bit bigger. So I'm checking the pods under Knative serving and making sure that they're running. And I'm connected through my phone, so hopefully things will work. We'll see. All right. Yes. OK, the Knative serving pods are running. I want to check the Knative eventing pods as well. Those are running as well. And finally, let's check Knative build pods. Those are running as well. So all the pods are running. I already installed Knative the way I showed you. And now we can talk about Knative serving and then look at some examples. So let's first cover Knative serving. So what is Knative serving? It basically allows you to deploy a container in a serverless way. And what I mean by that is basically you create what's called a Knative service, and you point your container in a registry. And then you just say, deploy this container for me. And Knative will deploy the container. It will set up the networking traffic for the container. So your container will be up and running. And all the traffic from outside is ready to be served to that container. Then you get automatic scaling by default. So your container will run on a single pod by default, but it will scale all the way up to n that you define. And also, it will scale down to 0 if you don't use it for 60 seconds or so. And then with Knative, you get configuration and revision management. So your service will have some configuration that you define. And then once you deploy the configuration of that service, you will have a revision for that service as well. So every time you change something about the configuration, you get a new revision. So you have revision management in Knative. And finally, since you have these revisions, you can do complicated things like traffic splitting. So you can say the latest version gets 50% of the traffic and the previous version gets 50% of the traffic. So in a nutshell, you basically point to your container. The traffic is set up for your container by Knative. You get configuration and revision with Knative. You get automatic scaling. And you also get traffic splitting if that's what you want. And the primitives of Knative serving is something like this. So at the top level, you have a service. This is not a Kubernetes service. This is Knative service. So it's something different than Kubernetes service. So you have your Knative service that you define. Then you define the configuration of your service, which points to the pod. And the configuration can also have things like the environment variables and stuff like that. And once you deploy your service with this configuration, you get a new revision. And Knative will create a route for your revision. And the route will point to this revision. So by default, your latest revision will get all of the traffic. If you change anything about the configuration here, it will create a new revision, and it will update the route to point to that revision. So by default, the latest revision gets all the traffic. But you can also set rules here, complicated rules here, so that you can do traffic splitting and A/B and red and blue deployments and stuff like that. But at the very basic level, you have the Knative service, Knative configuration, revisions, and routes. So let's actually look at some examples. By the way, as I mentioned, all of this stuff is on GitHub already. So if you go to my GitHub, I have the slides and I have the tutorial here. So I'm just going to refer to this tutorial as we go along. What I want to show here is a Hello World example. So if you want to deploy just a Hello World container, what does it take on Knative? So what I do is that first, I create a very simple C# application. But this can be in any language you like, where it will look at some environment variable, and it will just say hello, and read that variable and just print it out. So it's something very simple. I build and push an image to Docker Hub. And then I create a Knative service. So the first thing that you're going to realize is that the API it's a Knative API. So it's not a Kubernetes service, it's a Knative service. I give my service a name. In this case, the service name is Hello World. And then you define the namespace that you want the service to be deployed to. In this case, I'm just deploying into default namespace. And then here is the configuration of my service. The first thing to point out is that we have something called run latest. This means that when I deploy this service, it will get all of the traffic, right? So it will get 100% of the traffic. That's what run latest means. And then the configuration is the configuration of my service. The first part is the image. So I'm pointing to my Hello World image with version 1. That's the image that I pushed. And then I'm also passing an environment variable called target that has the value of v1. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, from my code, read this environment variable and just print it out so that we can keep track of what kind of, what version of service we are running. So then I will apply this service, and then let's actually take a look at it. So let's go here. And what I'm doing here is that let's make this a little bit bigger. So I'm watching the Kubernetes pods, the Knative service, the Knative configuration, the Knative revision, and the Knative route. First, what you're going to realize is that I already have some pods running. These are pods that I already created for a demo that I'm going to show you later, so you can ignore them for now. But here I am in Hello World sample, and I already created a service v1 YAML file. So what I'm going to do is kubectl apply service v1. And what this does is it creates a Knative service immediately. And if we come back here, we see that a container is being created. A Knative service is already created. A Knative configuration is created. A Knative revision 1, generation 1 is created as well. And finally, a route to point to this revision is already created. So all the stuff that I talked about is already created. And the pod is already, the Hello World pod is already running. So everything is running by just applying this service definition. Now, how do I get to the service? As I mentioned, the service, the traffic in Knative is handled by a gateway, in this case, Istio. And in Istio, there's something called Istio Gateway that handles the traffic coming into your cluster. So what you need to do is you need to go to Istio, and you need to find this Istio Ingress Gateway's IP. And then once you find the IP, you need to curl that IP. But behind the same IP, you can have multiple services running. So in this case, what I'm doing is that I'm saying, OK, I want to curl this IP, but my host is Hello World. That's the name of my service. Default is the name of my namespace. And example.com is the default example domain that you have in Knative. So that's how you will get to your service if you haven't configured your own domain. Now, you can also configure your domain. And in my tutorial, I show you how to configure that domain. So there's all these details here that I'm not going to go through. But what I did is that there's also something called nip.io. It's a dummy domain service that you can use so that you can, for example, treat things like IP address.nip.io as a domain name, as if it's a domain name. So I did this because I don't want to set up a domain. So I show you all the details of what to do there. And then in the end, you can basically just hit your domain name with your service name and get to your service. So let's try that out. So if I do a curl. Now, what's happening here, by the way, is that you see that, I don't know if you've seen it, but the pod was terminating. Because we haven't used it for 60 seconds, it went down to 0. So it scaled down. And then when I did a curl again, it scaled up again. So it always scales down and up as you use or don't use your pod. So I did a curl, and it says hello v1, right? So our service is running. All the details of the networking and everything is taken care of for me. The pods are running. Everything is working for me. Now, every time you change something about the configuration, Knative creates a new revision, right? Remember, like we changed the configuration, it creates a new revision and updates the route to that revision. For example, in this case, what I do is that in my service definition, I change the environment variable from version 1 to version 2. Let's do that and see what happens. So I come back here, and I do kubectl apply. But instead of v1, let's just apply v2, which changes the environment variable. Then if you come back here, you will see that immediately Knative realized that change is creating a new container for the new revision. The new container is running, and it already updated the route to point to that revision. So if we do a curl to the same address, now it says hello v2. So it already updated the traffic to go to the same version. Now, if you want to do a code update, what you need to do is you need to change your code, and you need to push your image, and you need to deploy your service again. So in this case, what I'm doing is that instead of saying hello something, let's just change our code to say bye something, right? So that's my code change. And I built my image and pushed to Docker Hub, and I come to my service, and then here I change the image from version 1 to version 3. And if we apply that change, so let's apply that. And by the way, you can see that this is terminating now. This is the version 1 that's been scaled down to 0 because we are not using it anymore. So that's the good thing about Knative is that it does that for me automatically. Now I deployed the version 3, and I think it's already running because we have a generation revision 3 that's already running. So if I do a curl again, now we are running by v3. So we are running new code already. Now, of course, you don't do this in real life. In real life, when you want to deploy new code, you usually deploy the new version, and you let it get a percentage of the traffic, like 10% or 20%. So you want to do something like traffic splitting in real life. And you can do that with Knative as well. So what you can do is that you can come to your service definition, and then instead of doing run latest, remember, we had run latest in here, right? That made sure that the latest version got all the traffic. Instead of doing that, we'll do a release. Release means that we're going to have 2 revisions where we're going to split traffic between those 2 revisions. So in here, what we are saying release, and then here we're listing the revisions. So I have 2 revisions, 001 and 004. And then I also have a rollout %, which is 20. So what this means is that the first revision, this one, the existing revision, will get 80% of the traffic. The latest revision that I'm going to create will get 20% of the traffic. So that's the new revision. And the configuration here is for this new revision that I'm creating. So in this case, all I'm doing is that I'm using the same image, but I am the target value here is v4. So v4 is my new revision. So let's apply this and see what happens. So I'm applying service v4. But one thing I forgot is that when you look at the revision IDs, they are actual hash codes, right? So it's not 001. Instead, it's this here. So let me just copy this, and then come here and change 1 to that. And then the 4th one, the latest one that I deployed, is this one. So copy this and deploy here. And now let's do the real deployment. So now I'm configuring it again. And now what should happen is that the version 1 should get 80% of the traffic, version 4 should get 20%, but let's see if this is the case. So what I want to do is that I want to copy this curl command. So I'm basically doing a curl command within a for loop just to see how it works. So we're doing 10 curl commands, and you can see that a container has been created. So it's version 1, version 1, version 1. At some point, it should say version 4, hopefully. Now it's creating version 4, so it hit the version 4, and it's the first time, so there's cold start, and now it's hitting version 4. Oh, I didn't. Let's try again. Sometimes it doesn't do it right away, so it's still version 1. Maybe I made a mistake. I don't know. Oh, version 4. Yeah, there you go. So you saw the version 4. So 20% of the time, it should be version 4. So that's how you can do traffic splitting between an existing revision and a new revision. You can also do traffic splitting between 2 existing revisions. So let's say you already have 2 revisions running. All you need to do is you need to do a release, and under revisions, you need to refer to the revisions that's already created and that's already running. When you do that, the configuration here is going to be ignored because you are referring to 2 existing revisions that's already deployed. So the configuration here will be ignored. So that's how you can do traffic splitting. And everything about autoscaling in Knative is configurable. So what I want to do here is that let me deploy a service, and let me hit that service with some load and see what happens. And in the meantime, as we are loading that service, I can come back and talk about how you can configure autoscaling. So what I have here is that I have a service that just sleeps for 4 seconds. So it's kind of simulating some work. And then I'm going to use Fortio, which is an open source load testing tool, to hit my service and see what happens. So let's first deploy the service. So instead of hello world, let's go to sleeping service. And let me actually delete all my services. Oops. kubectl delete knative service all. So this deletes my hello world service. As you can see, everything is gone. And now let's apply service YAML for my sleeping service. So this should create a new service that will just sleep when it gets a request. And let me copy the Fortio command. So I built and pushed the image. And then this is my Fortio where I'm just sending some requests to my service. So this sleeping service is running. And let's just send some load. So that should be fine. And in the meantime, I can show you how to configure this. So the way to configure autoscaling is that, first of all, the default autoscaling looks like this. It's concurrency-based autoscaling, meaning each pod will get this target amount of traffic. So in this case, it's 1, but the default is 100. So each pod will get 100 requests before it autoscales, right? But what I'm doing in sleeping service is that I'm setting this to 1 so that each pod will get only 1 request so that we can show autoscaling. The minimum and the maximum scale is also configurable. So by default, the minimum scale is 0, meaning everything scales down to 0 if you don't use it. But if you want to make sure that there's always 1 pod running no matter what, you can set minimum scale to 1. And then you can also set a maximum scale, in this case 5. You should always have some kind of maximum in your pods because you don't want to scale infinitely. So in this case, we're setting to 5. So that's concurrency-based autoscaling with minimum 1, maximum 5. But you can also use CPU-based autoscaling if you want. So if you don't want to do concurrency-based, you can do CPU-based. So you just need to comment this out and then put CPU-based autoscaling. And if you want to do your own autoscaling, you can actually write code and hook into your code here and do autoscaling yourself. So it's very configurable. So let's see what happened to our service. So here I'm hitting to our service with Fortio. And as you can see, our sleeping service scaled up to 5 because I had my maximum at 5. So everything scaled up already. And if I kill my Fortio, then it will scale down to 1 because I had 1 as minimum scale. So that's all I want to say about autoscaling. And you can also integrate Knative with anything you want. For example, Twilio. Anyone here used or heard of Twilio? A few people? Yeah, Twilio it's a great library service to do voice or SMS-driven applications. So what you can do is that you can get a Twilio number, a phone number, and then when someone calls that number or when someone sends an SMS to that number, you can handle that call or the SMS with code, right? So what I'm doing in this case is that when a user sends an SMS message to my Twilio number, I call my Knative service, and my Knative service will reply back with a message, right? So I wanted to see if this works. And it works because a Knative service has a public endpoint, and Twilio can make a call to the public endpoint. So to set this up, what I did is that I went to Twilio page, and I think by default, at least in the UK, for free, you can get a UK number. So this is my UK number. Feel free to call or SMS this number, by the way, because it's not me who's going to answer it. It's going to be Knative. But what you can do is that once you have this number, you can say, if someone calls me, make a call, webhook call to this endpoint. I didn't change this, so this is the default Twilio endpoint. But then for messaging, for SMS, I said, if someone calls me, make a call to this endpoint. And this endpoint points to my dummy Knative service / SMS. That will be the SMS control that will handle this call, right? So let's apply this and see if it works. First, let me get rid of the sleeping service. By the way, this sleeping service is scaled down to 1, as I mentioned. So let's just delete this, delete all services. So that should get rid of sleeping service. And go to Twilio. And create my Twilio service. Yes. And then what I have here is that I'm looking at my SMS messages on the web. So this is my SMS messages. And this Mete Twilio is my Twilio number. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hello from Voxxed in Athens. So let's send that message. So if everything works, this will send a message to my Twilio number, and Twilio number will make an endpoint call to my Knative service. Knative service will scale up. It will reply back. And in the end, we get this SMS message that says, the Knative copycat says, hello from Voxxed Athens. So it basically takes the message and just replies back with that message. And to do this, just to show you the code briefly, again, I use C#, but you can use any language you want. I created an MVC application in C#, and then here, I created an SMS controller, and I'm using the Twilio libraries. And then I say, OK, when someone calls this endpoint, I will create a reply. And in the reply, I will say, Knative copycat says, and just reply back with the message that I received. And then I just send it back. So it's very simple, but it shows you. And then once I do this, I create my Docker file, I deploy it, and then I create my Knative service somewhere. I don't mention it here, but on this page, I create a server YAML file, and then I point to my image, and that's it, really. OK, so that's Twilio. And what I show you so far is Knative everywhere. So everywhere you have Kubernetes running, you can do all of this Knative stuff, because it only relies on Kubernetes and Istio. But as I mentioned before, if you are on a cloud provider like Google Cloud, you will probably want to use something more managed like Cloudrun. Cloudrun, it's something that we announced last month, and it's Knative serving in a managed way. So you can think of it as like Knative serving, but in a way that you don't have to think about the cluster, in a way that you don't have to think about Istio and all the other things. So I just want to briefly show you the developer experience on Cloudrun and how it's similar to Knative, but at the same time, it's fully managed. So if I go back here, the first thing that I need to mention is that Cloudrun, it was just announced recently, and because of that, it's only available in US Central 1. So it's only a US, you need to deploy it in a US central location, but this will change very quickly. So first, I need to switch my project to a US-based project, so let's do that. And then this second thing about Cloudrun is that it doesn't support Docker Hub yet, right? So what I need to do is I need to take my image and I need to push it to Google Container Registry, which is similar to the Docker Hub, but except it's under Google Cloud project. So what I'm doing here is that with a single command, gcloud build submit, I am submitting my Docker file to the cloud, and it will build the image in the cloud, and it will host that image in Google Container Registry with this single command. So I already did that. I already hosted my image in Google Cloud. And once I have my image in Google Cloud, all I need to do is run this command. And let's copy this and run and see what happens. And I need to change this project ID to my project ID. So Cloudrun Atamel. So what I'm doing here is that I'm saying gcloud is a command line tool, better run, deploy, and I just point to my image that I already pushed, right? And the image is the same image as before Hello World v1. So this will tell me, OK, is this the service name? Yes. And then it's deploying, it's creating a revision, and it's routing traffic to that revision. So just like I show you on Knative, it's doing the same things. But as you can see, we haven't set up anything. We haven't set up any cluster. We haven't set up anything. We just said deploy this image, and all the details of what I show you is taken care for us. OK, so now this is deployed. And if I go to Google Cloud Console, I switch my project to Cloudrun. And then I go to Cloudrun. And then you can see I have some services, but this is the one that we just deployed. And you can see that I have a bunch of different revisions, but this one has been just deployed. And it already gave me a URL, so I don't have to worry about configuring domain, because it gives me a dummy domain. And if I click on it, it's the same exciting Hello World app, Hello v1, but it's fully managed. That's the difference between Cloudrun and Knative. So before I forget, let me switch back to my project. So let's do Knative Atamel. OK, so that should be fine. And then let me delete my services, because I'm going to deploy more stuff. All right. So that's Knative serving. Now I need to speed up even more, because I need to talk about Knative eventing and build really quickly. What is Knative eventing? Knative eventing basically allows you to connect event sources, different kinds of event sources to different kinds of event consumers, which are Knative services, basically, with some flow in the middle. So it basically lets you connect different things together using some primitives that it provides. These are the event sources that are supported. It's not the full list here. The full list is in this link. But basically, you can listen things like Google Cloud pops up messages. You can listen GitHub events. You can listen Kubernetes events or Google Cloud Storage events and many other events. And the way it works is that in Knative, you have something called sources. These sources listen for external events that you want to listen. Then they will pass those messages to something called broker. Usually, you have a single broker in the namespace that's ready to receive messages. From the broker, you want to pass these messages to a Knative service. But in the middle, you create what's called a trigger. A trigger, it's basically the thing that connects the broker to the service. But at the same time, it can also do some filtering in the middle. So if your service wants to listen only to this kind of messages, it can do filtering right here. And then it will only get those kind of messages. One thing to mention is that you can listen all sorts of messages, right? FTP, GitHub, or Google Cloud Storage messages. But in the end, when Knative receives these messages, it creates what's called a cloud event. A cloud event, it's an open source event definition. And in these cloud event definitions, you will have some metadata about the message. But the data part of the message will have the actual event. So for example, in this case, we are listening some GitHub events. And this cloud event, the data part will have the actual GitHub event. Then it will go to the broker, as I mentioned. The broker is one per namespace. Then from the broker, it will go to the trigger. The trigger will do some filtering. So if you want to just listen for Slack messages, for example, you can do that. And then it will pass it to a service that you define. So this is a Knative service. And that's it, really. So that's all there is to it. And I just want to show you one example of this really quickly so that you get an understanding of how it works. So what I'm doing here is that I want to connect something called Google Cloud Storage to Google Cloud Vision API. These are two separate services that have nothing to do with each other, but by using eventing in the middle, I want to connect them. So the way this works is that when a user saves an image to a Google Cloud Storage bucket, so it's a bucket where you can save any kind of messages, that will trigger a message to a pops-up topic. So you can have the buckets emit messages when something is saved. And then I will have Knative eventing listen this pops-up topic. And then it will pass it to Knative service to receive that message. And then the Knative service will make a call to Vision API to extract labels out of this image. Vision API, it's a machine learning API to extract labels from an image. So this is the flow. And to set this up, let's take a look at our tutorial. I have a Hello World eventing sample that we'll skip for now, but you can read it if you want. It shows you how to set up eventing in a really simple way. But I already have this. And then I also have a translation API where you can send messages to translate. But what we want to look at is the Vision API. So first, we create our Vision Vision code. And in this code, what we are doing is that we're going to be receiving pops-up messages that will get converted into cloud events. So we need to read cloud events in our code. So what I'm doing here is that I am defining the cloud events, and I am basically parsing the cloud events in my code. And once I have the cloud event, I need to listen the right type of event. In this case, when an image is saved, it's an object finalized event. So I'm looking for object finalized events. And from the cloud event, I am extracting the bucket ID and the object ID of the image. So I'm basically figuring out where this image is. And then I come in my code, I create a Vision client. This is a client that I'm going to use to make a call to Vision API. And I just say detect labels async. So this basically says, can you please detect the labels from this image with this URL that I extracted from the message? This will use machine learning to detect the labels. I will get labels with some scores. I will order the labels with the highest scores first. So I want to make sure that I have the highest labels first. And then I'll just log it out, right? So that's my code. I will build a Docker file. And then I will push the image to Docker Hub. And then eventually, I will create something called trigger.yaml. So in this YAML file, I'm doing two things. One is I'm defining my service that points to my Vision Docker Hub image. And I'm setting minimum scale to 1 to make sure that I have 1 running. And then I'm also defining a trigger that will connect my broker to my service, right? And I'm not doing any filtering here. So let's do this. Eventing, and then vision. And then if I do kubectl apply, trigger. So this will create the vision service and the trigger. And actually, let's look at the logs. So let's do kubectl get pods. And I want to look at the logs, so let's just copy the, where is the, this is how you would look at the logs. And let's look at the vision pod. Now it's waiting for messages, as you can see. Now what we need to do is we need to save an image, right? So to save an image, come to Google Cloud, switch my project to Knative, go to Google Cloud Storage. This is the place where I can save my image. There's a Knative bucket. This is the bucket where I will set the notifications, and I will upload a file. And let's choose an image. Let's say this one. So let's choose this image. I don't know if you can see it, but it's basically a beach with a nice sunset, right? So let's upload this. I don't know what happened. Oh, it's uploading. It's from my phone, so it's a little bit slow. So now this is being uploaded to Google Cloud Storage bucket. Once it's uploaded, it will trigger a message to pops up topic. From there, Knative eventing will read that message. It will pass it to Knative service. Knative service will get the image URL out of the event, and it will make a call to Vision API to extract the label. So if everything worked, and that's a big if, so you can see that we receive the content, and the content is it has an ID and a data. So it's a cloud event, right, with ID. And the data is the actual message. I parse that data, and in the end, make a call to Vision API. And then this Vision API says, this picture is labeled sky, body of water, sea, nature, coast. So it basically extracted those labels from the image, right? It's nothing fancy, but the point is that we are connecting two unrelated things like Google Cloud Storage with Vision API using Knative eventing in the middle. Now, I have a whole section to talk about build, but we don't have time for that, it seems like. But just to briefly cover what Knative build is. So far, we deploy services, and we kind of connected them using Knative eventing. But how do you actually build things, right? You need to build things, and you need to push those images to a repository like Docker Hub or Google Container Registry somewhere, right? So Knative build is for that. It lets you go from source code to a container image in a repository, and it gives you primitives for that. So there's something called build, which is a number of steps that you can define that will be executed. There are templates that you can install into your builds so that you can use those templates in your build files. There's builders to build containers and other things. And finally, there's service account to authenticate with Docker Hub and other places. And just to show you a couple examples of this, I'm not going to run them, but they're in my tutorial. So if you're interested, you can look at them. A very simple build, for example, here I'm defining, OK, I'm going to be done in 1 minute. Here we're defining a build, and I'm pointing to my source. This is my tutorial source. And I'm defining my steps, which is a single step that says build and push. I'm using a Canonical project that will look at this Docker file, and it will push to this destination, which is gcr.io. So this is how you can build this. And the way to apply this is basically just say kubectl apply, and just point to your YAML file. This will create a build object, and it will create a pod that will actually build your container and push it to Google Container Registry. And if you want to do it with Docker Hub, you need to authenticate. So to authenticate, you need to create a secret, and then you need to create a service account in Kubernetes. And then in your build, you just refer to the service account from here, and this will make sure that your build is authenticated with Docker Hub. And I show other things here with build packs and with build templates, but we don't have time for that. But feel free to check out my repository for it. So thanks very much. This is all the time I have. Yes, thank you. All of this stuff is on my webpage, and Knative has a new website called knative.dev, so feel free to check it out. Thank you.